Hi, I'm Chris Decker. Welcome to another episode of Mission Readiness. Today we have Hank Hendrickson. Hank is the Executive Director for the U.S. Philippine Society in Washington, D.C. since 2012. And he continues to serve as the Society's Executive Director. He is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with postings in East Asia. And Hank's experience in the Philippines, Singapore, and Korea, Europe, and the Middle East are all very noteworthy and applicable for our discussion today. During his postings in Asia, Hank spent 2 years in the Philippines, 2 tours, as a political officer from 1970 to 1983, 79 to 1983. And he was a counselor for political affairs from 1995 to 1997. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, he was a commissioned officer in the Navy, and he served in Vietnam. And Hank is a graduate of Bucknell and has a master's degree from Georgetown. So thanks, Hank, for coming here today.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. I'm delighted to be here. And with mission readiness important around the world for the United States and for others, I can't frankly think of another place that's more important and fits better with the concept of mission readiness than the relationship we have now with the Philippines. So happy to talk about the Philippines.
Well, maybe you just want to start talking about our relationship with the Philippines in terms of the current security environment.
The current security environment fuels what has become a very good and important relationship now in security terms with the Philippines. We've always had a strong relationship with the Philippines as a product of the history that goes back more than 100 years. The relationship has been generally good and certainly enduring. Fast forwarding it to recent times, the relationship, particularly on the security and strategic levels, has been more important for a couple of reasons. For the U.S., our priorities in East Asia and the Pacific look very directly, frankly speaking, at China and China's assertive and aggressive even policies and expansionist policies in the South China Sea and toward the first island chain. And so if the U.S. priorities and policies are geared to preserving stability in that region, which is what I understand our policies to be, the U.S.-Philippine Society is a non-government function. So although I was a former government person, I'm not speaking for the government, but just my understanding of our policies is that we and our friends and most of the region is a lot better off if there's a stable strategic environment in that area. And so for the United States, working with our treaty ally, the Philippines, it gives us platforms and opportunities, partnerships to work together to deter threats to that stability. And from the Philippine side, there's an interest that focuses on their national sovereignty and infringements on national sovereignty. Any country is going to be concerned about sovereign rights. And the Philippines, after all, is a democracy. Any leadership there in the Philippines is going to be responsive to their public opinion, and the public opinion, by all the polls that I've seen and anecdotally with people I've talked to, is concerned about what the Chinese have done in terms of reclaiming or the reclamation, what they call reclamation of some of the islands and features in the South China Sea and what the Filipinos will call the West Philippine Sea, certainly within their exclusive economic zone. So that's their interest, and so our interest in a larger sense fits well with their interest in deterring people infringing on their sovereignty. Of course, the Filipinos are also have a stake, like most countries in ASEAN and the region, in stability, which can lead to predictability and no surprises, where an economy can grow and they can cooperate with partners, and the uncertainties are minimized so that people can invest with confidence. So right now, there's an administration in the Philippines. It was elected in 2022, so 3 years ago that has invited the U.S. to work very cooperatively with the Philippines in these areas.
So, Hank, I mean, when you think about it, we are in strategic alignment with the Philippines, but there must be gaps. And when you look back in past times, there were bigger gaps. What has been the reasons for these gaps, and why isn't there a total strategic alliance? Where are the changes and limitations?
Right. Well, at one level, history plays a role in that, Chris, and that is that the United States, after the Spanish-American War, gained control of the Philippines, and much to the chagrin, frankly, of Filipino nationalists at that time, who had hoped that an American victory over Spain, which had been the colonial power for 300 years before that, would work with a new Philippine government that would be independent. Well, it took some time for that to happen. And in historical terms, it was about 4 decades. So, that's, I guess I'm older now. It doesn't seem as long a time to take to do something as it once did. But nonetheless, there were some real growing pains there. But there was always this sense among some Filipinos, and they were conflicted. I mean, they liked the relationship with the United States. They liked the United States. They liked American culture. They benefited enormously from American efforts to build roads and infrastructure and public health and education in institutions and civil infrastructure in a way that the Spanish, frankly, hadn't. So they liked that part of it. But then underlying that was this imbalance, if you will. The United States was still calling the shots up until 1946, after World War II, when the Philippines became independent. And in fact, the Philippines and the United States will mark 80 years next year of establishment of diplomatic relations based on 2 sovereign countries. So that's a milestone for you. And then throughout the Cold War, we had bases in the Philippines, as you well know, and some of the viewers here will appreciate. Some may have been associated with Clark, Subic, and some of the other bases, which were American bases on Philippine soil. That then changed in the early 90s, and at the end of the Cold War, there frankly was a period, well, here in Washington, what are we doing? Is this the end of history, or do we need to have deployments overseas? Well, pretty quickly, we recognized that there were threats, even though the Cold War was over, or the counterterrorism threats or global threats in other areas, or the rise of China and Chinese assertiveness. Then the Philippines and the United States, going back to 2014, when the Chinese were really being aggressive and doing island building and taking features in the South China Sea that were partly underwater and exposed only at low tide, and turning them into to islands where they fortified them. They built airstrips and docks and so on. And so they gave the Chinese platforms to control the South China Sea, which is one of the world's premier shipping channels. $4 trillion worth of goods flows through it. And I don't think anybody outside of China really wanted the Chinese to control that, the sea lanes and the airways. So in 2014, the Philippines and the United States agreed on the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which initially set up 5 sites, Philippine bases this time, not U.S. bases, but Philippine bases where the U.S. could have access. And then last year, they added 4 more EDCA sites to this, and in the north because of concerns both about the South China Sea and then a Taiwan contingency. So it's worked well for us now. There's a confluence of interest between the 2 countries, and it's probably not going away anytime soon. It could change depending on how Philippine leadership sees its national interests and how, frankly, Washington sees its interests and engagements overseas.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about 2014, that was when we started to talk about places, not spaces. Like, we didn't have to own bases anymore. We could actually lease them. We could cooperate with a local host nation, and we just follow an existing agreements. But, in the case of the Philippines, they don't have a host nation agreement, right? I mean, how do we operate there that's different than other places?
Well, there are a couple of foundational agreements. One is, of course, the Mutual Defense Treaty, which we don't have with many other countries, right? And that was signed in 1951. So again, we're coming up on, I think, the 75th anniversary marker for that. That's important. So that established an alliance, and it didn't talk about specific places or bases. But under that, there was the assumption, sort of common assumption, that the U.S. would visit the Philippines, and even without bases. And so I remember working there, and the bureaucrats got involved, and but if they come, do the sailors have to have visas, that kind of thing? Yeah. Well, that's impractical. If you bring in a carrier, you got 5,000 visas or something. And so they ended up agreeing on a visiting forces agreement. So under the MDT, the Mutual Defense Treaty, you had the visiting forces agreement, which permitted a certain amount of visits by the United States forces for exercising and for then doing other things that a Navy deployed in the Western Pacific would need to do, and the Philippines saw advantages in that. Then that followed with the EDCA agreements, and Chris, one of the things that the Philippines saw, I think, I'm not be careful to caveat that by saying I'm not representing the Philippines here either. Yeah. But my understanding is that there are advantages from the Philippine side, not just in the mill-to-mill relationship and transfers of knowledge and weapons technologies and operational skills and that kind of thing, but also in, for example, in natural disaster response, because one of the major threats to the Philippines is typhoons. It's on the Ring of Fire. You've got earthquakes and volcanoes, and so if you have American ships in the area that can come and or in the EDCA sites, they can position relief supplies to help people when natural disaster strikes, and unfortunately all too often it does in the Philippines. And going back to 2013 when Typhoon Haiyan, which is the largest tropical storm ever to make landfall in recorded history, hit the Philippines, I think I'm correct on this, that the USS George Washington was near Hong Kong, came to the central Visayas, the central part of the Philippines that was hit most directly, and was first on the ground to provide communication supply, clear away some of the debris, and help some of the injured. So the Filipinos remember that, and then they've written into these other agreements a role for the U.S. to play to work with local responders in the case of a natural disaster.
I see. So just to go back, the Mutual Defense Agreement is the base document, and then does the EDCA agreement just modify or enhance that, or is there a visiting forces agreement that underlies that as well?
I would look at it this way, Chris. I would say that you could do a visiting forces agreement without a mutual defense treaty, and we have with other countries. Yeah, you could have an EDCA agreement, Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, without a mutual defense treaty. What the Mutual Defense Treaty did outline, and where it's talked about today, is in terms of the commitment by the United States, and it's a mutual commitment, to respond to an attack on the Philippines. And if you're going to respond to an attack on the Philippines, it's better if you're somewhere in the vicinity of the Philippines, I would think. I would think so. And so that's how the MDT plays in this. And then the questions come, you hear them, well, what are you going to do in the case of if somebody does this? Well, I think both sides sort of agree that we're not going to get into the specifics in a specific scenario. It doesn't make sense because it's sort of hypothetical. I mean, it's fair enough to do that. But what at a policy level, there have been commitments from the current administration. Was Secretary Hegseth was there in March. Previous administration, administration before that, frankly, the word ironclad alliance is there. So it's a public affirmation that the United States has a strong, quote, ironclad alliance with the Philippines. And that alliance, if you read it, commits the United States to respond to an attack on the Philippines and vice versa.
Just to go back, I mean, from in 1951 when they put this in place, was that President Marcos Sr. at that time or someone else?
No, that was before Marcos. Marcos Sr. came in 1965.
Oh, so what necessitated them to do that in 51, you think?
Oh, it was a hangover, I think, from World War II, and where we had bases, and then the onset of the Cold War. And the onset of the Cold War, Chris, as you well remember, what else was happening in the world in 1951? The Korean War.
Yes.
Right? It was a year into the Korean War. China had just fallen, right?
Yes.
So the U.S. had to have, our policy was to have military assets positioned in the Western Pacific, and of course Japan fighting in Korea, and then the Philippines was a logical one because, we weren't getting involved in Southeast Asia yet, but it turned out to be a theater approach, level approach, where you would have assets in Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, Guam, of course, and then that grew from there, and it just made sense. I think certainly from fighting or being positioned for Cold War contingencies, and it was helpful certainly and I think to the Philippines. Although the threats probably at that point were more psychological. The Philippines was facing its own insurgency at that time, right? The Hukbalahap, and so U.S. support for building stable institutions in the Philippines, in the threat of what people, particularly in Asia, must have felt. What's the future here? China's fallen. North Koreans have invaded South Korea. Let's stick together, and part of sticking together was to have mutual defense treaty.
So when you think about this, things are pretty well aligned now, but is there critical elements that we could even improve the relationship even more? Is there opportunity in your mind of things that we could work with the Philippines even better?
Yeah. Well, yes, in short, and one of the areas where there might be at least a slightly different take on the relationship, it would be if the Philippines, Philippine leadership in addressing their needs and concerns looks at both the infringements of their sovereignty and wanting to deter that, as well as economic development. And they would argue that if they can develop economically, a stronger economy, that would help directly with their force modernization. They'd have more in the budget to do that. And, as well, that would be, it would reinforce the relationship with the United States. And just as if they could grow, they would feel weaker militarily if they're weaker economically. So when President Marcos came, he was elected during COVID in 2022, and he said, coming out of COVID, we want to rebuild the economy, and we don't want to just rebuild it the way it was. We want to improve it. So looking for partners to help that happen. So for the Filipinos, the security and the investment, trade, economic development issues are all tied together. My perception of the United States, particularly in this administration now, is that they're separated. I mean, when President Marcos was here recently, he made very little progress in terms of tariff negotiations. In fact, if the average tariff worldwide by this administration is 17%, one of our closest allies, the Philippines, it's at 19%. Now, one would hope, and I think there are people, certainly in the Washington policy world, and including, I would think, in the administration, that would like to say, all right, we're working together really well in this area, but let's build together on both sides of trade and investment. Not plenty of investment goes into the Philippines, but that's private sector, And that makes a difference. I don't want to downplay that, but you think there might be some policy decisions that would encourage that. I would hope, personally, and so that's one of the things. The question was, what could we do better? Yes. It would be to take a look at where we are with trade and tariffs and see if we could do better in that area. And there's some hope there. It's that decision on 19%, may change. I mean, because my understanding is that the Filipinos are ready to discuss further, trade-offs in terms of, tariff reductions and opportunities for American investors and importers into the Philippines. So these discussions will go on, and let's hope that they can, that there can be some progress in that area in a way that helps the Philippine administration sell to their public the advantages of the relationship at the security level with the Philippines. And it's not just seen as a one-way street.
So that's a good area to look at maybe an area to focus on for the future. What are any other areas that come to mind that we could improve our relationship with the Philippines in terms of having it to be our strategic partner out there, both in defense and in business?
Answer that two ways. One, it's important for both sides to understand the remarkable impact that American investments have in the Philippines, and not just in dollar terms, but in the technologies that American companies bring. And we did a program, the CSIS here in Washington, did a very good study late last year on the impact of American investments in 6 key areas of the Philippine economy. And it ranged from agriculture to energy to IT and semiconductors. And even without a trade policy that eased and facilitated that kind of an investment, plenty of investments going in. And the idea behind this, I think, one of the sort of takeaways from it was that both sides, the U.S. and the Philippines, needs to understand that the United States is not going away in the Philippines. So there's a psychological barrier here. What can we do? Is to remind people who need reminding that the U.S. is an investor, that the economic relationship, the trade relationship with the Philippines is historic. It's been there for a long time on the part of many companies, and there's plenty of new ones coming on, and that if there's a perception that the future is with China among the Asians, that not so fast. The United States is going to be, yes, they're going to be trading with the Chinese, and the Chinese are huge power, but not the only player, in that block. So that would be one thing. And on the other side, we would want to make sure that it would be nice, for example, Chris, if we can work cooperatively in areas like disaster response to support the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation. The USAID did a lot of work with the Philippines, right? And in institution building, civil institutions, and otherwise, and in health. And the U.S. Institute of Peace, a lot of work in brokering relationships in the southern Philippines between the Muslim and government forces there in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, Muslim Mindanao. Those institutions aren't functioning the way they used to, but who knows? Maybe they can be folded back into the State Department or some way in the years ahead to play a role, which will be not only help the people who are dealing with tuberculosis and its outbreak now, but also in terms of cementing that soft power relationship.
Yeah. Needs to be reconstituted.
It will be in some shape or form, I think.
I think so too. I think they're just going to announce who the new Foreign International Assistance lead is going to be at state. So I think some of that role will go back. But when you think about geopolitics, then this idea, your second point, where we have to make sure the Philippines believes that the U.S. is there. It's not China is not the only choice. I see that in my visits there regularly, where the Chinese seem to be controlling all the social media, and the kids only see advertisements on how great China is and how bad the U.S. is. And it reminds them that maybe we're not their right partner. How do you think the alliance will address these threats, and what's the next step?
Those are tough issues in terms of social media and outreach. I think there's a role principally for the Filipino leadership in this. And it would be with some risk that the U.S. would think that we can go out and fight those psyops wars again. It's really what we need to do is to show that the Philippine government and establishment is a solid partner, that there are advantages in working with us and other like-minded countries, and they need to make that case. And they can do that. The Philippine government, as you well know, has done, I think, a terrific job in this administration. The Philippine Coast Guard, for example, with their transparency initiative in going out and showing what's going on in the West Philippine Sea in terms of the sort of the shadow war that's going on there that sometimes becomes real and lethal. But showing that to viewers in the Philippines and even internationally, there's no reason that they can't work on that in other areas as well where there are challenges. There have been a couple of good books written on that, so get the word out. But I think it's up to Philippine institutions, and to the extent that the Chinese have used clubs and sister city associations and this scholarship money to spread their influence. The Filipinos can work on that. I think educational exchanges are an opportunity for cooperation that hasn't been fully developed in a way, and it can be anything. Now, Georgetown University, you mentioned, I did graduate work there, has just set up a campus in Jakarta, Indonesia, and it would be a logical thing, and I've talked with them about this, to recruit Filipinos who are interested in a U.S. education. I mean, a Jesuit to Jesuit, for example, they could go to Jakarta and then get a U.S. education there. There are other organizations that we've worked with, the American Councils for International Education, that have programs so that we can expose Filipinos who don't need as much exposure as some other peoples around the world to the United States. After all, a lot of it happens through families and informally, as you know. But to keep those educational links close, and that can help in this area of the mindset.
Yeah, I think that's another element we could really look at to improve the relationship. What about gray zone activity? We saw the previous administration there kind of not deal with it as much as the current administration. What's your thoughts in general about how gray zone's proceeding, and what's the impact to our alliance on this?
I think it was the transparency initiative, and that is showing people both at home. I think that's the primary target audience for the Philippine Coast Guard, as well as when 60 Minutes goes out there as well and shows it here. It is good. Also, what the Philippine Coast Guard and to a lesser extent the Navy has done is to be persistent in, for example, their resupply missions. They haven't given up, and they haven't given up in the face of the Chinese response, which one analyst pointed out has been below the Navy level, below the sort of the warship to warship level, and that the Chinese aren't interested in ratcheting it up to make it military force versus military force, Navy and Air Force, going in to a Philippine island in the EEZ. And the Philippines has done the same thing, and they've confronted the Chinese. They've kept the low-level kinetic activity at the sort of the Coast Guard level. And it's just not the only place where the Chinese have encountered people standing up to them. The Vietnamese, probably even more so than the Filipinos, have asserted their sovereign rights in these areas, and so the Chinese, so far, I mean, they've succeeded in sort of the salami slicing, the slicing a little bit here and there around the edges, but they haven't been able to kick the Filipinos out of areas, and they haven't won the mindset battle, which is the international and legally recognized 2016 claim that or a decision by the arbitral court, that undermined the whole Chinese claim based on historical purposes or historical rights, so-called, to the South China Sea. So you've got some equilibrium there that seems to be working for the Filipinos. The extent to which we can have a presence there, the extent to which they can modernize and have better forces, will help them not be faced down by the Chinese in the West Philippine Sea.
Yeah. So do you think the alliance has a role here in some regards, or?
Well, I think the alliance of interest, the alignment of interest, more than in the background, the alliance is important. And certainly it would undercut confidence in the U.S. commitment if somebody decided, well, we don't need the mutual defense treaty anymore. So that's not going to happen anyway. Nobody's talking about that. So at a confidence level, yes, that's important, and for sure that the alliance. But it's really the Filipinos value the alliance, but they also value the association that they have and support they receive from what they would call like-minded countries on these issues. Right. And they've had a lot. When they started out with the arbitral, the case that went before the arbitral tribunal in The Hague, they were pretty much alone. And then when they ended it and the court ruled in the favor of the Philippines and against China, China was pretty much alone on that. So they turned international attitudes and opinions on that South China Sea case around completely. It's possible they could step that up by going to the UN again, maybe in New York and maybe at the General Assembly, and getting a reaffirmation from a majority there. Chinese will have some say, of course, and they can be persuasive. So it might be risky, but it's something that they could think about, or at least working actively, and not just on the claims issues, but in terms of the exercises. When they do joint exercises, bring in more countries, and they are doing that.
Yes,
so that is, I think, that reaches a certain comfort level with the Filipinos, not to have just the U.S. alliance relationship being front and center as they look at their defense needs, but to bring in others, like-minded countries, and they're doing that. And they're doing that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of commercial interest in the Philippines. Obviously, now there's more and more military interests. You see a lot of U.S. contractors in different organizations, large businesses are there, lots of military gear, U.S. gear supporting the alliance. What would be the political challenges to this closer relationship? How do you see this in the future?
Well, at a policy level, if the Filipinos began to see their national interests as being not well served by the relationship with the U.S. in terms of defense cooperation, even at a rather sort of ground level, that would undercut it. If they decided that they wanted to go back and try to do, tilt toward Beijing, that would obviously, I think the Chinese would say, okay, we can help you, but you're going to have to soft pedal the relationship with the U.S. or, not move forward with some of the ambitious projects and building up, particularly some of the facilities in the north in Cagayan and Isabela. That kind of thing could happen. There's an election in the Philippines in 2028 for the presidency, so it's still 3 years away. But this one could have an impact on that, depending on who runs. We don't know who's going to run now, and then who wins. And one of the analysts that I trust there says, when you're trying to analyze Philippine elections, most of the factors there are local. It's who's in control here, how they can influence voters, what are the issues of importance to the voters, and they tend to be pocketbook issues or, local issues. But in this case, there may be interest or certainly consequences on the outcome of the election for foreign affairs. And so foreign affairs could play a role in that 2028 election in the Philippines, and that would be the China versus sort of orientation in our direction. So keep your eye on that.
Yeah, good point. I mean, when you look at the Asian nations, a lot of them are going the middle road, trying to be on the middle road. Philippines tends to be going our way this time around. How does this all play out for the smaller nations there between the two great powers?
Well, I think you're exactly right. And when we look at the Philippines, it would be a mistake for people here on our side to see that if the Philippines are working with the Chinese on deals, to think that, let's, my God, what's going on here, and are we being damaged in some way on this by that? It's inevitable that all of the ASEANs, some more than others, are going to have a strong relationship with China. And the Philippines is sort of, in a way, maybe catching up with some of the others. Now, they're not going to go as far as Laos and Myanmar and all that, but they could well be, in the middle with a relationship. And I think you're right, too, that most of the ASEANs would like to see a strong role for the United States. They would all have their wish list about what our policies would be. And the Filipinos would have different, set of priorities than Indonesia or Malaysia, perhaps, in their relationship with the United States. But they're going to want to play, they're going to want to have a relationship. And it's not just between the relationship with the U.S. and China, but Japan, for example, and the relationship with the Philippines is huge. It's the number one investor aid contributor, and so it's an important relationship. And they're an alliance partner of the United States, so that works then to our advantage in a sense too. So, and there are other countries that the Philippines will have a strong relationship. So it's, let's not consider ourselves to be the Chinese may think of themselves as the Middle Kingdom and all that, but we're a strong alliance partner. I don't want to minimize that, but we're not the only player out there.
Yeah, it has changed a lot, right? In just the last 10 years, since Chinese activities, it's really caused other investments. I mean, I just heard recently Taiwan is talking about investing in the Luzon corridor for the first time.
Yeah.
So
right.
It's turning out as maybe it's beneficial for the Philippines. Who knows?
Could be. I mean, it's a natural. If one looks at the map, Kaohsiung, Cagayan Valley, and Subic, Clark, Batangas. It can be a corridor of sorts there, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So when you think about our military histories going back and, political histories and the ups and downs of our relationship, do you envision that it will continue to progress, or is it really politically driven where this is all going to go?
As long as the U.S. is committed to having a policy that preserves stability in that region, and we've expanded it from the Westpac to the Indo-Pacific, that we're going to be committed to deter Chinese expansion into and beyond the first island chain. And the Filipinos, we will continue to want to rely on the Philippines as a partner in that. And then conversely, as I mentioned before, if the Filipinos, the Philippine government leadership feels that their sovereignty is being threatened, then they're going to want a relationship with us. So can it be built upon? Yes, in technical ways, certainly in ways of influence operations and upgrading of military. I mean, the Philippines still needs a lot of help in modernizing the armed forces and in pivoting from internal defense needs, where they've been fighting insurgencies ever since we talked about the early 1950s. They still have 30 or 40% of the armed forces in Mindanao. And so to the extent to which they can find peace or make peace in the BARM and Mindanao and with the NPA, and then they can pivot to territorial defense is going to be helpful to them. And the extent to which we can facilitate that is to our advantage and theirs.
You know, going back to the time where we departed the Philippines, we left the bases and we didn't renew our agreements in the early 90s. Do you know what were some of the root causes that caused them to agree to allow us to leave? That might reflect on what you're talking about, where if we don't invest in this relationship, we could find ourselves going the opposite direction, right?
Yeah, I mean, the global, issues. I mean, the global picture changed dramatically in the early 1990s with the end of the Cold War. So we had Cold War bases in the Philippines. So there was a question there of, on our side, what's the United States going to do now, in the specific sense of how much of an overseas presence do we need when there's no threat? I mean, the Chinese weren't a threat at that point. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and then and so there were. It was sort of hard then for us in our own minds. I think I'm reading this just in talking to people who were there on the scene at the time, Chris. We're trying to figure out what we're doing, not just in the Philippines, but Thailand and other places. Do we need a foothold in Asia, that kind of thing? And so we weren't sure. I think on the Philippine side, there was some nostalgia for the relationship, and the vote in the Philippine Senate to not do the bases extension agreement was very close. It was, I think, one vote, but there were the arguments on the Philippine side, and not just on the campuses. Where time has come. We don't need foreign bases here anymore, and so let's have a good relationship with the United States, but let's not have foreign bases here. So that was one thing. And of course, then you had Mount Pinatubo, and then things began to change. In early 1995, the Philippine aerial reconnaissance spotted a Chinese flag on Mischief Reef in the EEZ of the Philippines. And I happened to be there at the time in the Philippines and was called to take notes for our ambassador, John Negroponte, to get briefed on this. And we saw the pictures, and this was early 95, a couple of years after the bases closed. So at that point, people were saying, we have a different problem now than we thought we did. China it was on a nipa hut on a feature that was at high tide underwater. And now Mischief Reef is a dock, harbor and airstrip, and it's got missiles and all that stuff. So that then, people say, well, if Subic and Clark were still operating, they wouldn't have done that, right? I don't know if that's true or not, but that was what was out there. So that began to, make it helped persuade people to look for ways to kind of get our security relationship back together in some fashion. We still had the MDT, the Mutual Defense Treaty. And so by the late 1990s, we had the Visiting Forces Agreement. By 96 and 97, we had ships come in. I remember the USS Independence came to Manila Bay, and it was the first ship since. And that was really, people loved that. They had the med lights out. It was just a beautiful thing. Great visit. And so then you take that up through their court case and the and then to the EDCA negotiations in 2014, the Visiting Forces Agreement, and so I think both sides are comfortable now. You could correct me with what each side is providing, and so but that's kind of
But when you go back to that history when you were there, you look at Germany. Germany has never asked us to leave. And I don't know what their security posture is, but I don't know if they're too worried. But you think about the Philippines. They got to the point where their Senate decided to let us exit. They wanted us to exit. So what do you think the things were that we could learn from today as we look to the future of our relationship? What caused that at the time?
Well, some are under our control and some are beyond our control. I mean, what the Chinese are doing sort of beyond our control. And the Philippine security establishment understands that. They didn't see that in 1991. Yes. Yeah, okay. Number two, the benefits then that they would have in an arrangement that was not an American base with American troops stationed there is more acceptable, palatable to the Philippine establishment and elites. So I think where we have that, and then for example, one of the largest, as you well know, U.S. overseas air base in the Cold War period was Clark Field in the Philippines, and Clark today is a manufacturing and transportation hub that employs probably 5 times the number of Filipinos that were employed during the height of the basis period. And so there are economic advantages that the Filipinos received from what they inherited, both there and in other places that had been American bases. So they're better off. They're running, Bonifacio Global City used to be, an American base. And it's just remarkable the conversion, the success of that conversion has taken place. That doesn't exactly address your question, but it shows that we were, there was a legacy there that worked. They built upon that legacy without the U.S. having to stay there. And who knows, there might be some benefits to some of the EDCA improvements as well that will benefit the Philippines, both locally and even nationally.
Let's talk about the economic resilience between the nations. You talked about tariffs. You talked about more investment. Where do you think, what else do you think we could do other than foreign investment, other than tariffs? Is there something else that comes to mind? You talked about education, of course.
Well, in terms of trade and investment and tariffs, what I would hope that the U.S. government would want to do, is to keep the negotiations going on trade with the Philippines and not cut off that process. That the talks would continue. They'd find a way to see that the terms of trade would improve, but also perhaps we would see an advantage. We do have free trade agreements with a number of countries that could benefit us, and a free trade agreement with the Philippines at the policy level would offer opportunities for the United States. We'd sell a lot of agricultural products, for example. We would have access to critical minerals, and there's a lot to be gained from this, and maybe in semiconductors as well. And I think the Filipinos would benefit. Now there are probably groups on both sides that would oppose it, but it would like to see the process continue on that. And in these other areas as well, exchanges.
We noticed on the tariffs there were some countries had carve-outs on certain areas. Maybe that's another area. How are the negotiations would proceed? How would you make sure that there's still discussions going on? Is there working groups that are doing that, or?
They have had discussions going on. They had their economic czar here twice, Frederick Goh. They've had the Secretary for Trade and Industry here. They met with Jameson Greer, the USTR, and who's really sharp, and and it's that channel, USTR, for their trade people. Yeah, and they don't have to be in the same room to have talks,
Right.
but we'd like to, and they have had talks really since early this year, and we'd like to see that continue and prosper.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Hank, what other things haven't we talked about that would be related to your experience, and how should the U.S. proceed in terms of our relationship? What's your thoughts on all your experience over there?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, Chris,
Yes.
and so I'm not sure I have anything that is really worth while for your listener, except to say that the Philippines has a unique place in the history and the relationship with the United States. Our only colony, really, and as a country that the U.S. was an anti-imperial country in many senses at a time when the imperial powers of Europe and Japan were holding on to their colonies. We reluctantly acquired a colony, again by one vote in the U.S. Senate, to acquire the Philippines, and there were strong feelings either way. We worked very quickly to set a pathway for Philippine independence from the end of the Philippine-American War in 1904 to 1916, so 12 years later. There was an explicit congressional language, legislative provision for Philippine independence in the Jones Act, and then we built on that, and then it led to the Commonwealth period in the 30s, and then to incredible, which allowed. I mean that underpinned U.S. Philippine cooperation in World War II. Without our commitment to Philippine independence, they wouldn't have been fighting with us, right? They would have maybe looked in a different direction for their independence. But they stuck with us. And this was Quezon's advice to Carlos P. Romulo and others. So we've had that strong relationship in the past. And to be mindful of that, to know the history. This year, as your viewers will understand, marks the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. It's also the 80th anniversary last February of the Battle of Manila, and then the Philippines tried to rebuild after the war, gained its independence in 1946, working with the United States on that. So there were, in that generation of Americans who had served and there in war and then became senators and policy people here, remember the Philippines. The Philippines is, so it's important to understand that history, but when we started, just to say this, the U.S.-Philippine Society in 2012, part of the mission was that by that time the old hands were fading away here, and we thought, well, how do we raise awareness of the Philippines, the historical relationship, but also the Philippines of today and the relationship today. And so we went after it in different ways with programs and that kind of thing. But right now, that task, frankly, is not that hard. The Philippines is in the news.
That's true.
Would have liked to have seen a little more coverage of President Marcos's recent visit, but okay. It's people are aware of it, and so we want to, and it helps as we fashion a way to cooperate and to strengthen that relationship to understand the past.
Well, and so what is the charter for the U.S.-Philippine Society?
It's to raise awareness of today's Philippines, primarily among American audiences, and to strengthen the relationship between the two countries.
And is there anything that you guys need?
Countries and peoples.
Oh, the peoples. Is there anything that the U.S.-Philippine Society needs or they would like to have?
We would like people to support programs, and for example, we're supporting a program of Philippine cultural significance. It's at American University, Kasten's Arts Center on September the 6th. They're featuring for 3 months Philippine fabric artists, women, Philippine Americans, and I'm sure a lot of people would be interested in that. There's some fantastic examples of Philippine culture that we all know of, the music and, in this case, the art. is terrific, and support that where we can. We're going to be doing a program next summer here in Washington to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries. So I want people to come to that. And then, we're a nonprofit, which we got no government support from either side. So if you're Filipino, if you're American or a Filipino American, and you want to join the U.S. Philippine Society, please do. Check our website. It tells you how to do that. It's
And the
you can just Google U.S. Philippines Society.
The society has both American and Philippine.
Yes, sir.
Nationals.
It's a binational organization leadership. We have co-chairs. We have dynamic co-chairs, Ambassador John Negroponte, and then Jaime Augusto Zobel de Ayala, leading light in the Philippines. So there's commitment on both sides to make this work. And we do cooperate with the governments. We don't get government support. But, unless it's a raw political issue, which we tend to stay away from because we're bipartisan. But the society has succeeded, Chris, over the last 13 or so years in being, helping to provide consistency in the relationship amid changes in political leadership here and there, right? Because the countries have to get along, the peoples get along, we try to promote that and understand the motivations, policy directions of the respective administrations.
Hank, I can't thank you enough. Thanks for your leadership on the U.S. Philippine Society. And this is another episode of Mission Readiness. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.